Hello and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Nathan Rittenhouse.
I'm your co host, Cameron McAllister. In this episode, we talk about That Hideous Strength, perhaps one of Lewis's most prophetic books. He wrote it in 1945. It speaks directly to us in 2025. We think you'll find this very helpful. And as always, like, share, and subscribe. And if you find value in what we do and want to get behind us and support us, you can do that by going to www.toltogether.com. Thank you so much.
Cameron, you recently gave a talk on the book That Hideous Strength that wasn't a summary of the book That Hideous Strength for the C.S. Lewis Institute. And I was like, man, that is a super Cameron thing to do, to not talk about a book while talking about a book, to give the major themes of the book, but not the story of the book. So congratulations for being consistently on brand. But since all of that information is fresh in your head, I grabbed a copy of That Hideous Strength off my bookshelf here. And we're going to talk about some of the themes that are in that today. So first of all, why don't you give us a setup on the context of where you're giving and why you're giving this presentation, and then maybe a short summary of the story, and then we'll jump into some of the themes there that are. I mean, once we started thinking about doing this, I was looking around YouTube, and there are quite a few other apologists are like, C.S. Lewis kind of predicted the 21st century here, pretty on the nose.
Yeah.
So as you're listening to this and thinking, why are they talking about this? You'll see. Hang in there.
We do a series at the C.S. Lewis Institute called A Book Observed, which takes its precedent from C.S. Lewis's A Grief Observed, but where you take a book by C.S. Lewis, you talk about that book, have a discussion about that book. So we've been doing the Ransom Trilogy here in the Atlanta area, and the final installment, so that begins with Out of the Silent Planet. The second one is Paralandra, and then the final installment is That Hideous Strength. The first two are straightforward science fiction stories, all featuring the character of Ransom. The final installment is a bigger novel. It's a much longer story. I do think, and this is just my personal opinion, so take it with a grain of salt, I do think C.S. Lewis is trying to do a little bit too much with That Hideous Strength. There is a lot to appreciate here, but so much is going on. It's a dystopian novel, but it's not a typical dystopian novel. This doesn't read like Brave New World. It also features Arthurian legends. It also has elements of astrology in it. It's got there are so many different things going on. Merlin is in it, for goodness sakes. So to give it's it's a fairly convoluted story too. You have a lot of characters, has a lot of twists and turns. I'll give a, a very bare bones plot summary, but you can look that up very easily. But it starts with two characters, Mark and Jane Stoddard. Mark is an up-and-coming university professor. His field is sociology. He's working at a place called Bracton College in Edgestowe. And he is finding himself being drawn into the orbit of an institution called the National Institute for Coordinated Experiments, i.e., the
Nice.
NICE. So the deeper he goes, at first, you get the impression that these are sort of annoying, smug, mild-mannered, kind of bureaucratic people. They want to purchase they have a very controversial land purchase they want to make. They want this section of the college because it contains what purports to be Merlin's grave. They actually have deep interest in getting Merlin. But as you go deeper and deeper in to the NICE, they become more and more actually evil. And it turns out they're hell-bent on world domination. And they have some very definitive ideas of how to shape and direct and guide humanity. But meanwhile, Jane is on a very different journey. His wife, they're in kind of a troubled marriage at the beginning of the story. And I'm going to actually not give away too much here. I don't want to throw in any spoilers here in case people haven't read it. But Jane is also an academic. She's a PhD student at Bracton College. She is doing a dissertation on the poet John Donne. But she's kind of stalled in her research. She's kind of stalled in her marriage. But she's having this series of very disturbing dreams. And it turns out that her dreams are actually prophetic in nature. And something supernatural is happening. So just as her husband is getting drawn into the web of these evil people at the NICE, Jane finds herself being drawn into the web of good people. And Ransom is in that company as well. Now, Ransom doesn't play as major of a role in this particular novel. He's kind of he's the main character in the other two. He's not in That Hideous Strength. So don't let that sneak up on you. Also about the first, not quite first half, but you have to get a good way into this story before any kind of supernatural elements begin to make themselves known. So it starts off it feels almost like it's a work of realism at first, but then eventually all sorts of action takes
Yeah.
place and
Yeah.
all sorts of, it ends up being a very fast paced, very filled with twists and turns and all of that. But here's the thing. It's a lot of people are now will now say, a lot of perceptive readers have said that this is one of C.S. Lewis's prophetic books, that it speaks very directly to our moment. And that's kind of scary because
Yeah, that's
part of
right.
what Lewis is doing in here is pretty creepy.
If you want to
And
technologically
it has a
sustain
non
disembodied head as the ruler of the world, hmm, yeah.
correct. Yes. And it has as is typical with Lewis, it has a non-fictional counterpart, which is a lot shorter, and that is The Abolition of Man. So very I mean, That Hideous Strength is the fictional counterpart to that essay. So they can be read very well together. Another really helpful essay for this particular novel is The Inner Ring, which is about the death by a thousand cuts that kind of leads us to a a sort of a bad moral
Mhm.
transformation. You know, the small little compromises to fit in with a certain crowd. Lewis, of course, is going to draw from his own experience as an academic to show how this often works, where people will slowly sacrifice their morals and their convictions so that they can fit in with the right set of intellectuals. But you can apply this in many different areas in the field of athletics, business, wherever you find yourself. This is a common human phenomenon, this desire to be part of an inner ring, and it plays out very powerfully in That Hideous Strength.
So I think this is one of the places where Cameron Lewis particularly lands, I think, kind of in the Christian conversation, like, what's the value of fiction? Um, and like, why are we talking about this? Why is it written this way? Well, first of all, because the story very powerfully conveys a set of ideas. I think that's one of the strengths of maybe your Tolstoy's and Dostoevsky's is their ability to write narrative stories that are arguing for theological, like, or sociological deep principles at the same time. They're doing two things at once. But also, like, just keep in the back of your mind that Lewis is writing this, what, like 1945? And you're trying to think, like, are there
Yep.
organizations that had this wonderful vision of how to rule the world and were willing to do just about whatever morally in order
Yep.
to craft their, utopian vision of society? Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yes.
It's smack in the middle of this being kind of foisted upon the global consciousness, so to speak. And so he's writing that type of um we often talk about prophecies, the future, but also the prophetic, the ability just to describe the present accurately as well. And so Lewis gets
Mhm.
both parts of that, I think, in his writing, which is why it has kind of the classic staying power that it does. He's describing a moment in time, but he's also describing humans in a moment in time. And then as you kind of project those human tendencies that are unchanging out into the future, that's why it feels like he is speaking to us here now, 80 years later. Um, with some of these core ideas.
All science fiction I think this was William Gibson who said that all science fiction is really about the present. And
Mhm.
also, you find that if you look at and Lewis was a fan of science fiction, by the way, and he was a fan of some of the people who were writing science fiction in his own day, even if he didn't buy into all of their assumptions. So, for instance, he liked H.G. Wells. H.G. Wells had a very dark side too, and I actually want to bring that in just a moment. So, well, let me bring it in here. H.G. Wells, if you read his, The Time Machine, War of the Worlds,
Mhm.
he's a very celebrated science fiction writer, but he was also in his day a premier intellectual, and he was a very forward thinking man, and he was an atheist. And I can't remember what precise book it was, but John Gray draws attention to one of his books in which he says, "What about those backwards races?" I think that's his phrase, and he has in mind of course minorities, and he has in mind of course also people who lived in remote regions, and eventually he says, well, at some point they'll just have to go. Now he's saying this in the context of as we progress as a human, as the human race, and we move on to greater and greater forms of enlightenment, certain people will just have to go. And that's just one of many, many examples of the numerous intellectuals who held similar sentiments. And C.S. Lewis was deeply aware of that and was very concerned about it. In some ways, That Hideous Strength brings together some of his major concerns with modern forms of idolatry. And so, and he's also he can look he is looking to Nazism, of course.
Yep.
Bolshevism is another example. But he in The Abolition of Man, one of the sections on, I think he calls them the conditioners. So people of H.G. Wells's mindset who see us as shaping humanity into something greater for the future. Well, the way that actually would play out, Lewis says, is that it's not going to be humanity, whatever that means, picking itself up by its bootstraps. It's going to be a small cadre of elites making other people do what they want. Shaping, they will be the ones doing the shaping, and other people will be forced into the shape. That's the way this actually plays out. And then if you look at history, that's the way it actually plays out
Plays out.
as well. And that's what,
And it's also
yes,
the
and those are
fears
the
of AI right
aspirations.
now, like all the tech bros. I mean,
Correct.
this is the national, the global conversation we're having right now is how do you not have a couple large language models basically rule what everybody sees and thinks and knows and
Hmm.
does?
Yes. And so those are the aspirations of the nice too. And at one point in the novel, without giving too much away, they stage a riot basically. No, this was taken right out of the Nazi playbook because the
It's been
Nazis
out
did do
80
this.
years. You can give a couple spoilers.
Yeah, so they stage a riot so that they can then bring in martial law, and so the nice then are able to bring in their own police force, and then they take control. And their whole goal is to seize control in the first place. Now the other interesting feature here is, now again, Lewis is I'll just say Lewis is doing so much in this book. I'm tempted to say too much, but I want to be careful there because a person I deeply respect, my old professor Holly Ordway, who knows much more about this novel and much more about Lewis than I do, this is her favorite novel. So I'm just going to say it with a grain of salt. So there's a lot going on, but the other thing is you mentioned the disembodied head, Nathan, which is a big part of the story. So the nice scientists and people all believe that they are keeping this head reanimated with science. But as you read the book, you come to recognize that they are being deceived. There are demonic powers at work.
Hmm.
And they think they're in control, but they're actually in the hands of evil powers and principalities. And Lewis is also drawing a connection between some of the darker exploitative aspirations of sorcery in the ancient sense and some of the ways in which modern science, some of the ambitions behind some modern science. I'm trying to word this very carefully because there are a lot of people out there who, one of the critiques against Lewis is that he's anti-science, and you can see that very clearly in That Hideous Strength, the way he villainizes and demonizes the sciences, and you can see that in The Abolition of Man. I don't think that this is true, but
Well, so this goes
anyway,
back to
I'll
like,
leave
so
that there for now.
let's just put something on this because your dad asked a question in a conversation we were having. It wasn't recorded of, and this is just a good one for everybody to think of. Are you seeking, why are you seeking understanding? And the fact of the matter is that oftentimes people are seeking understanding in order to gain control. So, like, why are you reading the news? Why are you trying to understand X, Y, Z? Is it so that you can manipulate and control, or so you can actually, like, what is the value of understanding and knowing? Um,
Hmm.
and what is your motivation for doing that? And so I think in something like this, whether it be sorcery or technological development, why are you seeking understanding? Is it in order to put your is it in order to control, or is it to serve? And so there are just these types of questions that are kind of deep personal you have to wrestle with and think through kind of issues. But then also, isn't it in that so that scene you're talking about where like they fabricate the crisis so that the riot comes in and then they send in their own police,
Yeah.
and then Mark writes an essay about how good of a job that the nice
Yes.
security does in responding to the riot, but he writes the media publication before the riot even happens. And
Mhm.
so
Yeah.
it's a
It's
critique
carefully
of
coordinated.
it's a carefully coordinated, and I think but again, I think we live in a time when a lot of people feel like, yeah, this is what we're being fed. We don't
Mhm.
trust the media by and large at all. And
Mhm.
if it came out that on some riot somewhere in our nation next week, it turns out that somebody wrote a review of the critique of this police force before it even happened, I don't think anybody would be surprised. You'd be like, yeah, that makes sense. And so there's a cynicism about what we're fed and a cynicism about why we're being fed what we're fed and a deep sense of distrust in the utopian visions that were given by those who seem to have power and authority around us. They're like, okay, 80 years later, still works.
Yeah, and I was thinking this creeps into our lives in kind of insidious ways. I was listening to an exercise scientist I find helpful. I'm gonna leave the scientist unnamed, but they were, and you'll be able to figure this out through a little bit of research if you listen carefully, probably. But they were talking about how they recently underwent some surgery, some body modification, not because they weren't in any ill health, but this person got has also gotten into bodybuilding and for aesthetic purposes underwent a drastic invasive surgery. Then he's sitting down with with a doctor in the podcast, and then he's outlining all of his future planned surgeries
Mhm.
to, and this guy's thoroughly secular, by the way, and very smart, and is describing in careful scientific terms precisely these modifications that are going to be that he wants to have done to his body so that he will look exactly the way he wants to look. And it just made me think, here's a picture of the sciences being used in a manner that is completely connected to control, to the shaping of human life in a way that really reflects kind of modern values, but I think that are actually quite dangerous. But that's just, I mean, not all of us will go that far, but all of us have at our disposal so many different tools to try to kind of shape our lives and shape our very bodies that I think, it's one thing to point to the to tech bros. It's one thing to point to the, utopians and
They're
futurologists and
just giving us what we want.
transhumanists. That's still right, because they have the traction they have because it's very much in line with the way that a lot of us are conditioned to think right now, and just do think.
So Um, one thing I want to point out is we have a faithful listener to this podcast called whose name is Ransom. So shout out, hey Ransom, how you doing? Um, so that's kind of fun, named after a character. You don't run into many people named after people in this whole trilogy. But um, help us turn the corner here a little bit, Cameron, then on thinking through, okay, it's a fascinating story. It's a good critique of society, the tendencies of the human heart, our desire to monkey with the media, our willingness to compromise death by a thousand paper cuts on our actual character by seeking reputation, what we're willing to do in order to feel like we're included, the harmony between technology and the physical, the interaction between the psychiatric and the hard scientific, all of that's there. Great. When you think through a book like this and you think about living in a modern time as a Christian and recognizing that C.S. Lewis was a Christian as well, what are some of the, I don't know if I even want to say ways forward, but like, how do we push back against these tendencies that are there as Christians?
I think a huge Yeah, that's a good question. And that's why, incidentally, Lewis is bringing in some of these ancient lines of thinking into the story. That's why there's Arthurian legend there. That's why he wants to. Lewis was very devoted to and knew a lot about, of course, English history and English literary history, but he also loved the medieval cosmology. And
Mhm.
if you read The Discarded Image, for instance, he talks about the beauty of that vision, and he talks about though it is scientifically inaccurate, there is rich wisdom in it, and there is a lot of deeper truth to it because it presents to you a vision of a hierarchical universe where everything has a part to play, and there's a harmony, there's a great chain of being. That all is actually true, and it remains true. We've lost sight of it when we've bought into a kind of mechanized vision of reality. So, how can we take to heart some of C.S. Lewis's lessons here? I think part of what we have to do is for one, I've said this quite a bit. We have to slow down a little bit. We have to stop trying to optimize human life. I mean, there's nothing wrong with trying to find good ways of living well and tips and strategies for efficiency in our lives, but we often, without realizing it, I mean, the interview I just described to you earlier, we often end up defaulting to treating ourselves like machines and treating our bodies like glorified machines, and we are not. And we can say we are not until we're blue in the face, but the habits of our lives have to actually reflect that. So, as a humanities guy, and Lewis was a humanities person, I'm going to recommend some ways to do this. Slow down, read history, try to understand the past, also cultivate a sense of wonder and awe. Lewis is really big on this because, and he especially talks a lot about this in the Abolition of Man. He has that whole, I think the first section of that book is called Men Without Chests. And he's borrowing an idea from Aristotle here, where most people naturally eventually grow into fairly rational habits and pursue their self-interest. I mean, there's some variation there, but for the most part, we don't have to be too trained to look out for our self-interest to try to optimize our lives. That this is language that wouldn't have been used back then. But the passions, what we care about, what gets our attention, what is worthy of praise, that has to be trained. That requires virtue. That requires a well cultivated heart. In other words, the chest. And so people who devalue all of that, the training of one's sensibilities, end up, if we're not careful, being the men without chests. And that's what in the nice, basically, the members of the nice have killed their humanity. They've come to, no, they haven't done it, they weren't born that way. They've come to a place. At one point, one of them, when he's on the verge of death, wonders at the last minute before he burns to death, oh, is there a soul after all? And then, basically, in the midst of this horrendous scene, chastises himself. It'd be better to, this burning to death is preferable to even that thought occurring in my mind.
Hmm.
Now, you have to beat yourself into that kind of mindset. That's a kind of almost soul lobotomy that's taken place. So, but we have to recognize, in order to do that, we've got to move away from a vision of reality that looks at everything just purely in terms of its utility, social function, or pragmatic value.
So is there a sense here? Um, which book in the trilogy ends with like the crazy, like the embodied, like the spiritually embodied planets basically showing up in like all this splendor and
This one,
glory? This one, that yeah.
That Hideous Strength.
So because
There's too much happening in this book.
but
Yes,
but
that's in this one.
I remember reading that and thinking that is the best biblical commentary on the book of Ezekiel that I think I've ever read.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
and
Ah,
and
that's an intriguing way of putting it.
what
Yeah.
I think is going on there is that, and what might be part of in answering my question, that in Ezekiel's vision, I was just talking to a friend and neighbor of, we got wheels inside wheels and eyeballs and wings and clear, like who knows what Ezekiel was seeing. I think he was just giving us the best approximation of what he was seeing because there's no earthly referent for this glorious, splendid reality that he's like, whoa, there's a
Yeah.
whole nother realm of truth here that is so majestic and strange and glorious and good beyond anything that we can comprehend. And Ezekiel's trying to kind of sketch this out for us with words. I think you have elements of that certainly in the book of Revelation, any kind of apocalyptic literature, really, of like actual visions of God. That as this comes to the end of that kind of just the the grand splendor of what is spiritually true and real dwarfs all of these other pursuits and distractions and um, really fits into that
Mhm.
Lewis kind of idea that usually our pursuits are too small or our gaze is too low. We're not thinking large enough. And so it seems like
I
there is a
think
solution there in our time to be like,
yeah.
whoa, hang on a second. When you say stop and slow down, let's add stop and slow down and recognize that spirit precedes matter. There's a
Mhm.
infinitely glorious and splendid God who speaks reality into existence, and everything else functions in light and in light of that and is a derivative of that. And then it just helps us kind of
Mhm.
prioritize what's really worth being concerned about. And so there has to be some sort of response to revelation and worship in our lives systematically, in my case, that helps me recalibrate what's actually a problem and what's really not worth getting fired up about. Um, but
Mhm.
it's in light of the relative orders of actual power, actual splendor, actual glory, actual good, actual truth, actual reality.
I mean, Lewis is also at pains here to point out that some of us might be disenchanted, but the world itself is not disenchanted and is in
Oh, right.
fact the site of a grand cosmic battle. And
Whether
that's
you
why
believe
many
something
of
or
those
not doesn't
elements are
make it true or
there.
false. That is the
Precisely.
chaotic, like we all, it's a syllogism, like
Mhm.
we all know that, but we do live in a time in which, like, um, not my president, not my God. I just like, no, they like just
Right.
because you don't like, so let's say that
Yep.
I don't like
Personal
rattlesnakes. That
preference
doesn't
doesn't
mean they
dictate
don't exist.
reality. Yeah.
Like they're there. I have to deal with them in the world.
Correct.
Like so so
Yeah, I mean, if you look at take the Middle Ages, where the reigning assumption, if we can call it that, I mean, this is kind of anachronistic language, but most people just assumed spiritual forces were everywhere and influences were everywhere. And we were open to those influences, like wind chimes almost. Yes. Could it get superstitious? Sure. You could see a hobgoblin behind every stone and a demon behind every windmill and whatever. But who is closer to the truth?
well, that's
Those
the million
people
dollar question.
who were somewhat superstitious perhaps, but recognized the inherent spiritual nature of reality, that we were deeply affected by it, or somebody today who's an inveterate reductionist and just explains everything away. Everything's a glorified episode of Scooby Doo, and you know how Scooby Doo goes, right? Scooby Doo is there. There's always an ostensible monster, but as the gang investigate, turns out it's just a good old fashioned criminal behind a mask, or there's some elaborate ruse to get what they want, and the monster is never real. I think a lot of modern disenchantment, I can lay the blame at the feet of Scooby Doo. I'm just kidding, but that's so who's closer to the truth? Well, Lewis is going to say the medieval vision is closer to the truth. Yeah, you might think it's Bronze Age, you might think it's primitive, or you might think it's, backwards, and we've outgrown all that, very benighted. But in fact, this is the nature. If the nature of reality is indeed spiritual, then these people had a deeper insight that
Okay.
we moderns who think we're in control are just being misled.
Let me step on this rake. Which one of those visions produces a healthier humanity?
Hmm.
We hate to say it because I really like being far more technologically advanced for all sorts of reasons.
I like
The f-
anesthesia.
the
I'm a fan of aspirin.
dental work. Yeah. Um,
And dental work, yeah, modern dentistry is yes. I don't like elixirs.
However, there is
Just kidding.
a like, I haven't quite worked out, I've been hammering on this for a while, is that, um, an attempt to be God makes you less than human. I think that's what plays out here, and
Yeah,
you can't be fully
yeah.
human without recognizing the depth and your placedness in a spiritual reality, and be, A, at
So
peace, or not be a tyrant that leads to destruction, and so it's the rejection of God is the destruction of humanity, or maybe an abolition of man, some might say, but that's a just a it's true.
trying to gain control, and especially, and the more powerful you actually are, the higher the stakes, and trying to gain control over and shape humanity is an ambition that comes at ultimately, if you're successful, comes at the cost of one's humanity. So this
Somebody
is a
said something about,
satanic
like, what
kind of
was it? There was
movement.
this famous guy, somebody said something about gaining the whole world and losing your soul. What was that? I mean, that would have been a good
Yeah, who is
uh,
that? So
th
that guy was onto something, I think.
so, I like
JC was onto something.
so I think you have, like we can look at C.S. Lewis as, like, kind of a literary genius of taking complex ideas and analysis of spiritual and physical realities and putting them into story form, that here we are decades later discussing it, and then we can find these short sayings of Jesus that are, like, a two-sentence version of it. You're like, "Oh, yeah, that's that's what it was." Um, so, I don't know. Perhaps if you haven't, you should read what's the Space Trilogy, I guess, is it's,
Oh,
um
don't call it the Space Trilogy. They call
so
it the Ransom Trilogy because
the Ransom
Lewis doesn't like
Trilogy.
the word space.
I
Yes.
was I know, like, the Ransom Trilogy, but then I was looking at my copy of The Hideous Strength, and it says the last in the celebrated Space Trilogy. I'm like, I don't know what to do. The
I
publishers
know
want the
a
Space
lot of people
Trilogy.
call it the Space Trilogy. So
I'm saying the
I took
book
a
called it that.
course.
I'm like, but that's not the
It did. But that was against Lewis's wishes. Yeah, I took a course in my master's program on the Ransom Trilogy taught by Michael Ward, and one of the first things he said to us was, "You must
don't
not
call it the
call it the
Space
Space Trilogy."
Trilogy.
And you find you in I think it's in yeah, no, it's in Out of the Silent Planet. There's a passage in there where Lewis is pushing against the notion that of space as emptiness,
Mhm.
vacuity, and kind of this vision of cosmic horror. He has the scene where Ransom is in space and he encounters what he calls an empyrean radiance. So he's saying the opposite of what somebody like H.P. Lovecraft is saying. Or
Mhm.
think about the tagline of the original Alien movie, "In space, no one can hear you scream." Lewis is saying the
Oh,
opposite of
yeah.
that. He
So
wants
it's
to
all I mean, it's almost that space is the most densely packed gloriousness, and the planets are kind of vacuous bubbles within that.
Yeah.
Um,
And again, think a man who a mind tutored by medieval cosmology where he
or
sees that
who
there's a yeah.
read the heavens declare the glory of God and was like, well, that'd be interesting if we wrote from a perspective where we thought that was actually true. Um,
Mhm.
there.
Yeah.
So anyway,
Lewis,
back
part of what is so I mean, a
finish
part
it.
of what makes him so remarkable with all of this, what I really love about his books is how amazingly countercultural they are in some very healthy ways. It's really I mean, many of us, I get we all it's hard not to get just default to modern ways of looking at the humanity's place in the world and in the cosmos. And Lewis just is so good at not buying into any of it and portraying that very holistically in his fiction. So I got to give him lots of credit for that. I think this book is really long. I mean, I'm a fan of long books, but I think this one is perhaps a little too long, and I'm not the only one who thinks that. But I do ultimately think it's worth your time. I think the Ransom trilogy is worth reading. This one in particular, I think it just speaks so directly to our moment, and you can read it. It's a standalone book. You don't have to read the other two to appreciate that hideous strength. You'll gain more if you read the other two, but you can. It's a standalone book. You can read it on its own.
Let me finish with a complex analogy, and as we come to the end of a complex book. Um, Years ago, my brother was selling some cattle, and he took them to the market, and they said something about like, "What did these cows eat?" And he was like, "Grass." And they're like, "Oh, this is great! Like we'll market these as like grass fed beef." And he was like, What have we come to as a society where like the thing that cows normally do and eat
My cows are cannibalistic. I'm just
yeah,
kidding.
is that is like so why do I feed my cows grass? Because that's what cows like. So there's a sense in which like the cows are eating grass
Mhm,
because cows eat grass. He wasn't trying to like prove any points. It wasn't a marketing ploy ski. It's just like this is what cows do. I think there's a sense in which when we come to a lot of books and
mhm.
ideas, we can also say, "Oh, there's this book and this book and this book and this book," and at the end of the day, it's like, "Well, what did you read to come to that conclusion?" And you'd be like, "I read scripture." It's like cows eat grass. Christians read scripture. And you know what? If you read scripture, you don't need to read all these other books. Let's be very clear on that. And you will live in a proper sense of awe and worship and wonder and proper rebellion against bad ideas. It's all right there. It's a gift that God by his spirit has given you scripture to read and understand. So you can just pursue that and do that and it'll be fine. You'll get the whole package. But sometimes it is fun to see how some of the ideas that God has revealed to us in scripture play out in a more political, cultural, nuanced way as far as the way in which some of these great minds have taken those ideas and applied them in a story form to the rest of reality. And so, on one hand, enjoy these complex things, but let's never overcomplicate it to the point that Christians just reading and learning from Scripture seems weird, or that cows eating grass seems abnormal. There's a basic package of normality here of what God has gifted us in order for us to know, and we lean into that and should be able to delight and enjoy that too. So, super grateful to you, Cameron, for taking the time to wallow back through some of those ideas. I think what we've actually given here is a little bit of a teaser. Hopefully, this whetted your appetite to perhaps dip into at least That Hideous Strength, or maybe watch some summaries or recaps of some of the ideas involved there, um, and do that. But at the end of the day, to come back around and be like, the Lord has given you what you need to know. The fullness of His revelation comes through Christ, and not only is that enough, that's all of it. And so we rest and work and operate from that. You've been listening to Thinking Out Loud, a podcast where we think out loud about current events and Christian hope.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.